Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus Show live. We are happy to have you back. Yeah, we're happy to have you back. And always, we got a little Bob kicking at the beginning to let you know we love you. We want to make sure you're good. Had a few interesting things that are happening here today. First of all, if you notice, I kind of lost a tooth up here. So my smile will be a little broader today. But folks, don't let them fool you. We're happy to have you back here at the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus Show live. It's good saying it twice because I want to let you know you've got to stay engaged. Don't let them fool you. Keep a mind of your own. Your love. Okay, let's bring it down. It's always good to start with a little Bob at the beginning of the show just to kind of get people in the right mindset. I probably should be playing a different Bob song, but I like that one because it's all about love. It's all about knowing that you love your community. You love what it is that you do. You love your family. You love doing what you need to do with your business. But you got to stay engaged, folks. You've got to stay engaged. And as we usually do, we start off by talking about what I always talk about. First, I want to welcome folks here, Democratic small business owners, as well as small business owners that are not yet Democrats but want to be Democrats, supporters of small business owners, and just people who want to support small business in general. Folks, listen, it's show, episode, whatever you want to call it, number 68. And I just kind of get here, sort of casually. I wear my shirt. I let people know this is all about voting rights. It's all about showing what democracy looks like and just hopefully making it easy for folks to understand that you have to stay engaged. You have to stay engaged, folks. And before I actually do anything, you know what? I'm going to do what I always do. Listen, have you all got out there and gotten your shots? Because, you still got a couple hundred people a day dying from the COVID-19. So you definitely want to make sure if you haven't gotten your shots, get your shot. Things have kind of loosened up a little more. People don't have to wear their mask as much as they used to. And we have been able to bring down really the impact of COVID. But still, there's a lot of lingering effects from COVID, and COVID is still out there. So where you need to wear your mask, wear your mask. If you do want to get a shot, whatever it is, make a decision and take care of yourself to let you know, folks, we love you. We want to make sure that you stay engaged and stay healthy so you can get out there and do what you need to do. That's what you need to do. So, folks, we've had a couple of things that we've been able to do in the first year or so with this administration. It's been a beautiful thing. We've gotten a lot of things out there with the American Rescue Plan for small businesses and a lot of other things that have been passed. But I don't get into all the particulars about that. I kind of come back every week and just sort of have a guest on, talk about the importance of voting rights, because that is the basis of our democracy staying in place. And, I will try to move on to some other things, I will, but, right now there is a clear and present danger and threat. I mean, there's a 5 meter away from you threat to your democracy, and that is the voting rights of all Americans. Doesn't matter where you sit at on the side of the fence on this, whether you're to the right or to the left, whether or not you're sitting there in the middle, whether you're an independent, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, regardless of where you sit, if you don't have the proper access to voting rights, things will go awry, and you will not get the representation that you want or deserve on a local level, on a state level, or on a federal level. And when you don't have that ability to address things that are of concern for you and for your family and for your community, that's a direct threat to democracy. That's moving quickly down to what is known as an autocracy or dictatorship or theocracy, a monarchy. As you well know, I talk about it every time in every week, once a week. And, I give you a break because I bring a guest in about after I finish with my 20 minutes. Some people may call it a rant or, hey, he's going to talk about voting rights again. But I'm just going to repeat it again because I don't know who's listening and when they're listening. But what I try to remind people about is our government that we have in the United States is called the separations of powers for a very good reason. That is why we don't have a tyranny or we don't have a tyrannical ruler, because at least what the founders were smart enough to do, they weren't perfect by no stretch of the imagination, but they did know that they needed to do one thing. And that was, we were not going to grant all authority into a single individual. Because the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they said, good. Now, if you guys remember, if you weren't dozing in your 12th grade government class, what is separation of powers? What that means is we have a judiciary which handles the court systems, which also is supposed to make sure that the laws are being abided by. And the judges have the right to do that on a local level, on a state level, and on a federal level. I won't get into all the intricacies of the different types of courts, but the judiciary basically is the courts. That's one separation of power. The second separation of power is you also have the legislative body. And what do legislators do? The legislators have what's known as the power of the purse, or the ability to be lawmakers and lawgivers. They can pass any law that they want to from the legislature, right? And they're the ones who determine, okay, you can do this, and we're going to put X amount of money towards this. And this is, they try to get the votes from the people in the legislature. And if they get enough votes, they pass the law. That's how democracy works, right? One man, one vote. At least that's what it's supposed to work in its purest form, or one person, one vote. I don't want to be sexist about it. And then once that law is passed, if someone wants to challenge it, they can challenge it in court. And that, once again, is a whole separate body. So the people who basically look at whether or not laws are legal or pass constitutional muster, that's the court system, right? And the people who make those laws and attach any money towards, or money or financial things that affect people and affect businesses and affect families, decide who's going to get what, how much, if any at all, are all within the legislative body. And then, of course, so now there is one, there's the court system, which is the judicial branch, which is the separation of power. Then two, there's the legislative branch, which is the lawgivers, which is the power of the purse. And then the final and third separation of power is, let me put the fingers over here this way, the executive. That's right. And if you remember, the executive is the person who is in charge of carrying out and making sure the laws are faithfully adhered to. And on a local level, that might be your board of supervisors. If you're in a county system, with the chairman of the board, those are the chairman of the board would be the person who is actually the for people who don't have chairman of the board, if you have supervisors, or they may call them aldermen in certain places, or they may call them they have different names, but they represent the regional places, and they're part of the legislative body. But just to make it easier for people to understand, I think I'll use this word since I didn't write this down. It's coming off the top of my head. Locally, that would be your mayor, right? Your mayor is like the local person. And then the next step up from an executive office is the governor of a state, where you might be the mayor of a city, the governor of a state. And then ultimately on the federal level, what you have is the president of the United States. So that's the easy way to understand it. And I won't get into too many details. My wife would say, you're explaining too much, Mark. You're explaining too much. Make it simple. Keep it plain. Mayor, local, governor on a statewide basis for the executive. And then on a federal basis, we're talking the president. So basically you have three separated bodies of government. Now, why is voting so important? Voting is important because the people that you elect on a local level, on a federal level, and on a state level, and then on a federal level, excuse me, I apologize, no cough button. They're all there because you voted for them, or if you didn't vote, you voted for them anyway. Because when you don't vote, that's really kind of like voting. That's like saying, I'm giving my vote to the other side, because if you don't vote, then that's good for the people who want to get someone elected, and they don't want to have to have any sort of challenge to who they want to get elected by simply doing what's really known as voter suppression. So let's talk about this, right? Let's talk a little bit about how this whole thing happens and make it simple. And I'm going to go back to what I always do when I talk about this, is I kind of cover basically what I call like sort of the basic 3 areas of our civil rights that we have in this country, where a lot of the other rights are based off of things that we finally had to make clear to the country by making them federal laws. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I do every week, and I'll stop talking so much and bring up the image, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited the discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And basically, it did the same thing when it came to hiring on the basis of sex as well as race, and hiring people and promoting people or firing people. What they're basically saying is everybody has the same rights, and you can't be discriminated just based on whether or not where you come from, or what religion you practice, or whether you're male or female, or where you may come from, if you're a recent immigrant, or even if you're not in a recent immigrant to this country, whether or not you're a citizen or not. You just can't discriminate against people just because you don't like some particular thing about them. And then when you're in a job, they certainly can't do it based on your race, or your hiring or promoting or firing. But obviously that goes on. And what you see down there at the bottom is the protesting to the left, and you see a picture in the middle where you have Lyndon Baines Johnson and Martin Luther King that's there with him, and some other politicians that basically, when they signed that law, signed that legislation into law. And then you have the school bus with the children from all different communities working together. Now, civil rights are important because people just kind of wanted to do what they wanted to do, because if there wasn't a specific law that said you couldn't do something, guess what? Bad people are going to do bad things. And they needed to try to at least say, we can't get rid of bad people doing bad things, but we can say that it is illegal, and this is a specific law, and you have some sort of way to take them to court to enforce the law on the people who don't want to follow the law. Now let's talk about the next law that was passed. In 1965, the Historic Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. And I guess some people say, well, geez, you're supposed to have all those rights automatically in the Constitution. So why do we need to do this? Well, we have a varied, you need to understand history in this country. A lot of people were prevented from voting by people who were not good people or fair people, because they basically said, well, they would come up with all type of reasons why you couldn't vote. If it wasn't specifically said in the Constitution that you could or couldn't do it, then people would say, okay, African Americans are here, and they were brought here against their will and forced into to working for no wages and treated like chattel. Well, they can't vote. Okay, we fought a whole war about that. If you remember, it's called the Civil War. Say, hey, that's not right. Or if you're a woman, you can't vote. Or if you're from some other community, they'll just do all kind of things that prevent you from voting. And finally, after a lot of protesting, as you can see along the bottom, and a lot of people have given their lives for over hundreds of years, hundreds of years, through a civil war, through protests, through the American Revolutionary War. I mean, people have been basically fighting for rights in this country as Americans, and for even America to even be a country. But particularly the Civil War is really where this question was finally addressed. And even after the Civil War, still you had more problems, where you got to the point in 1965, which is during the Civil Rights Movement, there was a law that was signed on August 6th that said discriminatory practices adopted in many southern states was illegal. And you couldn't do things like in voter suppression type things like literacy tests, or forcing people to, count the number of bubbles on a bar of soap, or reciting the Constitution in its entirety, or just plain discriminatory things where they would, people like the KKK and terrorist organizations would just come burn your house down, or run you out of town, or just literally shoot you and kill you. I mean, there's plenty of examples of that through history. And the reason why the Voting Rights Act was needed in the first place, because there are going to be people who don't want to follow the law or what's in the Constitution. So you had people, as you can see in the first image on the bottom, where people are saying we need our voting rights, we need them now, again and again and again. And finally, in the middle, you see again Lyndon Baines Johnson, president, in 1965, there with Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, just a picture of them shaking hands when they finally got that historic legislation passed. And of course, that picture of a very young Congressman John Lewis, wasn't a congressman at the time, he was a college student who dropped out to support the civil rights movement. At that time, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where, you all will remember Bloody Sunday. He was an historic gentleman who worked to get that in place with a lot of other people, literally hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans, to make sure that that legislation for Voting Rights Act got passed. It was truly historic. But you know what, folks? That did not stay in place. Yes? You're probably saying to yourself, all that went on, we went through all of that, and yet we still have to continue to address this even after a civil war, and after so many people who fought and died in Vietnam and World War I, World War II, all over the world, supporting democracy in this country, that we still have people who don't believe that all Americans deserve the right to vote. And there's still voter suppression going on. Well, that's the case. And that's the reason why I'll tell you in a few moments some of the other things that had to be put into place to counteract some of that. But before we go there, I'm going to give you the last leg of this chair when it comes to your basic civil rights and where they come from in this country through recent legislation. And that is, the last one is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which basically prohibited discrimination in any way when it comes to the sale, the rental, and the financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. And later it was amended to add handicapped people and family status, whether you're male or female, or you come from an LGBTQIA community, or whatever it is. Whatever it is, they had to add more to it, because if you don't explicitly say you can't do these things, then people will do them. They would basically not allow you to live certain places, buy a home, either to rent a home, or either even get financing, so that you can begin to build some sort of legacy wealth. And there's just a whole lot attached to that with redlining and all the rest, but that's a conversation for another time. Or if you were from a different religious group, whether you were Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever it might be, Buddhist, who knows, they were denying you access to housing. And also based on what, national origin, what country you may have come from, or whether you're a male or female, or whether or not you're in a wheelchair or had some other type of handicap, or if they thought that you were single woman or single male, or you come from a LGBTQ family or whatever, all of that was basically said, nope, can't do that. That's illegal. All Americans have to have all the same rights. There's no favoritism towards any particular group, and we try to do equity, and we try to make sure that the laws are fair for all Americans, full stop. But people are never satisfied with that. Some people aren't, and they're working constantly to not really abide by what we say the values and the principles we have in this country. So let me tell you what else went on here. So what other thing we had to really do, because and the reason why I'm out here once a week, every week, making this and having making this discussion and having a guest, is to basically say some of those rights have been lost in voting rights. And right now, the law that's trying to put that back into place is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. In the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, basically this deals with what was taken out of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, put in place in 1965, and the portion that was removed was the Pre-Clearance Act. And the Pre-Clearance Act basically said before any laws are changed having to do with voting, it has to happen. The rule change has to happen at least 180 days before an election. And also, even before that happens, there has to be pre-clearance by the Department of Justice or the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. before making any legal changes that would affect voting rights for any Americans across the country, because the laws that were in place prior to that in 1965 meant that no matter where you lived, in what state or what territory, if you had voting rights, everybody had to abide by the same rules. But once that was removed by the 2013 Supreme Court decision to say, hey, there's no more need for the voting rights, this piece of the Voting Rights Act, we're going to get rid of it. But basically that has caused a problem, because people have gone right back to doing what they were doing before the Voting Rights Act. I'll say that again. They went right back to doing exactly what they were doing in Jim Crow and before there was a Voting Rights Act. You gotta kind of laugh at it, because you're going to say to yourself, well, what makes you think? If I give you an example, if they removed the law that said that stealing is not illegal, and said, well, people are all honest now, you don't need laws for theft of any sort, grand larceny for cars or thefts out of grocery stores. People are just basically honest. People have plenty of money. We don't need that. What do you think would happen to store owners and cars all around the country? People would be taking them, saying, hey, there's no law against it. I'm going to take your car. I'm going to go in your store and take your goods. Why? Because I can, because that's who I am. Maybe some people wouldn't do it because they're good people, but that's always the case. You got good people who aren't going to do bad things. Then you have bad people who really just don't care. It's the wild, wild west. It's the law of the fittest. And they will just come in and take what you have if they knew that there was no consequence or to them to make it happen. So what they're playing here politically or with our lives, and it's what's crazy, is that people are basically going in and saying you have to put this law back into place. So that's really what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does. To give you a quick analysis again of it, or a quick overview, is it modernizes the voting rights formula for determining discrimination in states and locality. It basically says any changes have to happen at least 180 days before an election. And it's also giving the government more authority to send in federal observers to monitor jurisdictions for potential risk of discrimination at the voting polls. So there we go. Let me get to the next one. I kind of carry on a little further on the last one. Let's talk about the act that was by the way, the John Lewis Act, H.R. 4, was passed by the House of Representatives, okay? And the H.R. 1 here now, the For the People Act, was also passed by the House of Representatives. And basically, it even expanded even more so for voting rights. And it basically said, okay, for one, we want to do this. We want to expand access to voting rights by having automatic and same-day voter registration. We want to have 2 weeks of early voting for all voters. We want to ban purging of voting rolls by, that basically says if you didn't vote in one election and you came back to vote in the next election, if you were a registered voter, they would say, hey, since you didn't vote last time, we're taking your name off it. And then you come to find out you can't vote when you show up just because you didn't vote in every elections. And it goes back to what I've been talking about. The next bullet point is full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was decimated by the Supreme Court in 2013. It also has finance reforms for banning foreign money loopholes, election security, independent commissions to prevent gerrymandering, and grants to help states to replace voting machines, and additional processes for auditing and securing elections. So you have 2 bills that were passed, H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. And in H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 passed out of the House of Representatives. And of course, the way it works is it's got to go to the Senate. And the Senate had something called the Freedom to Vote Act. And I'll just review that quickly because I have a guest waiting. But this is all good information. If you're just getting on here, you just want to know, hey, what's the Democratic Party trying to do to fix this? Well, here's what we're doing. There's been national voter registration prohibitions on voter roll purging. I just talked about that. And federal partisan for gerrymandering. There's been improved security measures that strengthen the ethics and standards for all 3 branches. For example, all presidential candidates would have to disclose at least 10 years of tax returns. That sounds familiar, right? You got that always happened voluntarily, but guess what? When it's not an actionable law, people don't do it. So they had to make it a law. They're saying we're going to say you have to do this now. You won't voluntarily do it. And also there's a prohibition of members of Congress from using taxpayer dollars to settle sexual harassment cases. Also, there was other stuff that's in that Senate bill 2747, which is the curb government influence in politics by forcing super PACs to disclose their donors. That's all about that dark money you hear him talking about, and requiring government contractors to disclose political spending. All right. If they're government contractors and we're giving them money, they're like, well, hey, you're taking money that the people are giving you, and then you're using that money to get your way. Well, that's a vicious circle. They're saying we want to stop that. Also, they wanted to prohibit coordination between candidates and their super PACs, among other reforms, what all has to do with the dark money thing. Probably have to do a whole separate session to talk about what that is. But the point I'm making to you is that here's what's happened. So you want to do what I always say. You can't, none of this makes a difference if nobody takes action. So what is our call to action? Well, our call to action is there's an activism app that's called 5 Calls. You need to get on your phone, basically, and say to your congressman or to your representative is that I know about the HR 1, which is the For the People Act. I know about HR 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I'm also familiar with the Senate Bill 2747, Freedom to Vote Act, and say, I'm aware of all these things. And what's great about this app that I'm talking about is this app basically loads in all the information that you need to have, has your phone number in it, phone number so you can reach your particular representative, and you choose the subject or the policy that you want to address, and you just basically are able to make your call. And it's available on Android phone or Google phone, whatever you want to call it. And it's also it's available on the app on the iOS system or the Apple phones, okay, iPhones. So there you go. I say this every week. I'm a one-trick pony. If you missed it this time, go back to last week. It'll be the same thing all over again. So this guy just repeats himself again and again and again. Well, guess what? Why do you think there are commercials? Because they work. If you keep saying it, people will remember eventually, and they'll say, oh, I'm going to try out those Oreos, man. I keep hearing about them. Well, I want you to try out this, making sure you keep your voting rights, okay? because I'm telling you what you need to do to keep their voting rights. All right. And that's what we need to do. So, folks, meanwhile, I've been doing a couple different things. And if you notice, this month is Hispanic Heritage Month. I've been talking about that for the last couple of weeks. You've seen my banner running across the bottom there talking about Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15th through October 15th. And we have a lot of Hispanic American or Latino businesses. It's a vast and varied Spanish-speaking community from a lot of different countries here in the United States and in our territories. So, but just respecting that, like you do every other group that's here in this country, we want to make sure that you know about the diversity of this country and all the great folks who were there in business, families, just folks who are all from the various Hispanic diaspora, or that Hispanic, if you didn't know, stands for historically Spanish-speaking people, or the term Latino is used. If I'm wrong, my guest is going to tell me, okay? This is what it means to me, and I love it, okay? So let me do this right here. I'm going to introduce my guest coming up now. He's been waiting for a minute. I've gone on a little bit longer than I normally do. But before I do it, I'm working my technology here. I'm going to bring up his promo, as I call it. Let me bring it up so I can tell you about who this guest is. Really is a great guest. Here we go. Boom. There it is. Okay, folks. So here you have a fantastic guest whose name is Jonathan. I'm going to butcher his name, and I've asked him, Dromgoole. And he is Mexican-made and Texas-raised and DC educated. Fantastic gentleman. I've known him for a while. He's a community leader focused on increasing representation for Latinx and LGBTQ plus community and policy and public service that he's been involved with. Jonathan is a double first generation graduate from the Georgetown University, class of 16 and class of 19. And he is an alumni of the Sorensen Institute of Emerging Leaders program out of UVA in 2020. And Jonathan, a little bit about him, his professional achievements. His professional and personal achievements, he's focused on social good and people-centered policies that actually enhance representation from the international development practices to local activism. So he's doing things on an international level. He's working things on locally. That's pretty good. I didn't know that about Jonathan. And also his professional capacity, he's worked and advised the White House. He's advised ambassadors, executives, policymakers, elected officials, and community leaders. So he's been really talking to folks really from the top to the, I don't want to call it the bottom, but right, you're talking to the White House. That's kind of the top for a lot of people. And also he serves on the boards of several local and national partisan and non-partisan boards. For example, Jonathan is also the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia. He is the chair of that organization for the Democratic Party of Virginia. And also he's with the League of United Latin Citizens. And in 2021, he was appointed by Governor Ralph Northam, Democrat, to serve as the inaugural member of the Virginia LGBTQ plus community advisory committee. And my technology going off here, folks. You guys always hear a phone ringing. But the last thing I want to talk about him, just to give you the full rounded view of Jonathan, is he's an advocate for inclusive leadership. Jonathan authored. He's an author too. What hasn't this guy done? I mean, he's writing books too. He's got a book out called Out to Lead, Shaping Queer Leadership, focused on unique leadership abilities and advantages of the LGBTQ plus community and how, through resilience, they are leaders that we need today. So, folks, just one more personal note, and without further ado, I am about to bring on Jonathan, and he's going to tell you the right way to pronounce his name, Dromgoole. And last personal notice, he lives with his husband Juan, and they have 2 dogs, and they live right here in Northern Virginia. We're proud to have Jonathan Dromgoole on the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus show. Man, I talked a whole lot, and I hope I didn't mess it up. Jonathan, correct me if I screwed up the name.
No. You got the name right. It's Jonathan Dromgoole. So thank you so much, Mark, for the introduction.
Okay, folks, thank you for putting up with me. I went a little bit longer, I think, or I started a little bit later, but either way, we've got Jonathan here now. John, I always ask all my guests when they come on and pass the mic, tell us how you got to be where you are and a little bit about you that folks need to know.
Sure. So again, thank you so much for having me. And I actually think the introduction that you were giving about voting rights and education is particularly important to the Latino community as well, because that's some of our history that we don't know of when we immigrate to this country or when we are born here and are trying to find those connections to why this country is our home now. And so going back into that, there's a lot of stories of Latinos that have played a critical part in getting us to this point, right? And getting us these critical legislative markers that have advanced all Americans. That's not the question you asked, but originally, so I'm from Guadalajara, Mexico. I was raised in Austin, Texas, and then I came to DC for college to attend Georgetown University, as you mentioned. First one in my family to do that. Loved education so much that I stuck around and got a master's degree in public policy instead of becoming a lawyer, which is where I thought I was going to go. During that time, I also met my husband, Juan. So I ended up calling Virginia home from there. You know, we moved into Arlington. His family's Venezuelan and lives up here in Northern Virginia. And so we found this to be home and have loved it ever since. And the longer I was here, the more I felt the need to be involved at the local level. And that very quickly meant that I was thrown into politics at the Commonwealth level. There's just not a lot of Latinos actually in politics and in public service in our Commonwealth and in our country. And so any opportunity to, you know, increase the Latino voice was something that I quickly took on. So I became the comms director for the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia, or DLOV, then became the finance director. And then there was an opportunity to run for chair, ran, got elected. And so now I've been serving 2 years with the party and the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia, doing all sorts of things I wasn't expecting to do, all other duties as assigned, as we can say, just promoting Latino activism, Latino candidates, but also the message of the Democratic Party to the community at the same time.
Fantastic. That, I mean, you kind of recap what I said, but I mean, I guess when you said originally when you came here, what you were coming from, where what state? It wasn't Virginia. What did you say? Remind me.
Yeah, so I came from Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. So you were raised in Texas, in Austin, pretty much, before you decided to come to Georgetown, to DC. Well, let me ask you a question. Why Georgetown? They got a lot of, great schools out there in Texas. Yeah. Why did you choose DC?
So originally, I actually wanted to become a chef. So there was no interest in politics. That's kind of the direction I was going to go. I studied French. I studied culinary arts. I wanted to go into that field. And as every good Latino does, I had a conversation with my parents, and my parents said, do something different. And that's how I eventually found myself with the other interest, which at that time in high school was Model UN. And I was like, oh, international affairs. That sounds like a great thing. Of course, not knowing programs for international affairs, I simply Googled various programs. I did not know anything about Georgetown University. For example, they really spoke about Madeleine Albright as their professor. I didn't know at the time who she was and why she was such a significant deal to the university and to the United States overall. So I applied on a whim to about 5 different universities, ended up getting accepted to Georgetown. So I came here without knowing anything about it, and then discovered, how challenging it was very quickly. But by the time I was a senior, my last semester, I actually had the honor of having Madeleine Albright as my professor. So it was a full circle moment where, I was one of those fortunate students to just get to listen to her stories and get to listen to more about, the US's role in American foreign policy or in foreign policy overall. At that time, however, I also started, I graduated from undergrad in 2016, kind of a pivotal moment in American history, and suddenly found the need to be more focused here locally instead of trying to spread my wings into representing the United States abroad in the Foreign Service, as is traditional for the university. So that's how I quickly pivoted to domestic policy issues and the master's in public policy after that. But I had no intention of going to Georgetown or any other university, really. It was culinary school was the original plan.
Well, that's interesting. There's just a few people say that they make certain decisions, but I assume you still have that great love for culinary, the culinary arts, if that's what you wanted to do.
So I do, but my husband is now the one that actually works and manages 3 restaurants. So the cooking is all on him now. My cooking has slipped through the cracks as I focus on other issues. So I no longer cook for very good reasons.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a good reason. Tell me a little bit about what your feelings are about Virginia and the participation of Latino voters, and how you think where they are now, and where you think we're going to get full participation for Latino voters in Virginia.
Yeah, so as was mentioned, I came from Texas, a state that has a tremendous Hispanic and Latino population. And then when I moved to Virginia, I expected it to be a little more progressive than Texas. I think I quickly found out I was in a progressive bubble up here in Northern Virginia. But as I've taken on this role and kind of expanded, I found out there's a lot of very similar issues that are shared with, Texas, across the Commonwealth here in Virginia. And then we just also have a much smaller number of Latinos overall. So it's been a challenge of just engaging with the Latino community. It's a much more diverse Latino community. I'm originally from Mexico. The community here is much more from Central America. So having those conversations and figuring out how to navigate that process has been interesting. But over the last 2 years, really, we've seen, especially with the census and its new numbers, have projected Latinos to be at 11% of the population in the Commonwealth, which is a significant number entering those double digits, because that means that we're tremendously important for the issues that you've already brought up, such as voting rights and talking to our legislators and talking to our elected officials, or one day becoming those elected officials. So it's really important now of how do we motivate the Latino vote, and how do we really get the entire Democratic Party behind the Latino community in every election.
That is a challenge just for all Democrats, and particularly I know you have some folks who are new to the community from the Latino community, but at least you have some sort of way that you've been successful in getting that accomplished. Any other things you want to tell us about, or talk about any other things? I'm going to leave this open. I'm not going to drive it with my questions. What else do you want to talk about, Jonathan?
Sure. So I'm happy to keep talking about the power of the Latino vote and what DLOV has been doing on that route. So again, 11% of the population now identifies as Hispanic or Latino. And to kind of go a little bit into the nuances for some of the folks that may be joining us for this conversation. So as you mentioned, Hispanic means anybody who's from a Spanish-speaking country. So normally that includes Spain, but includes Brazil on the continent. And then when we're talking about the Latino community, we're really focused on anybody who's on the continent, which in that case excludes Spain, but brings in folks from Brazil. So for us, it's the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia. However, we serve all members of the community here who are based in Virginia, and just making sure that they have that representation. And so a little bit of what we've been doing over the last 2 years of my term is just engaging with local Democratic committees, really at the ground level, to establish local Latino caucuses, and making sure that at the most basic level that the Latino community has a place where they can go in and have a sense of community and conversation. What we've discovered, across my time here, is that Latinos don't want you to reach out to them a month before Election Day. Right now, we're receiving a lot of calls as an organization. We're receiving, requests from candidates or from other folks saying, hey, I would love to engage with the Latino community and drive out the Latino vote and have information in Spanish. I'm like, that's fantastic. Where were we 3 months ago, right? And this is something that we continuously have to push forward, and saying we need to start thinking about the Latino vote a year ahead of an election. The Latino community is not a monolith, as every other immigrant community and every other community of color, represents. We're not a monolith. We're not just a one-size-fits-all. And I think for a long time, there's been that approach that the Latino vote is going to be a Democratic vote. And we're seeing that while, yes, a large majority of the Latino community believes that the Democratic Party, it's the ideal party for them, we still need to work for it every single year and every single election cycle. And so that's where those local Latino caucuses can really come into play, and just being able to build that relationship with the community and driving that out. That way, when we're 3 months from election day, we're able to say, hey, we've provided all these resources as a party, whether it's small business development resources, whether it's information about vaccinations and COVID, whether it's information about education and those types of resources, and saying, we've provided this information, now we're asking for your vote after the party has shown up and the party has done a tremendous amount of work for the Latino community and has done its part. Exactly. That's how Latinos play the game. We're happy to have these conversations, but we want to make sure that we're also included and have a seat at the table when those decisions are being made. And for far too long, that hasn't happened. And now with that 11% of the vote in the last elections, that's where we're seeing that we're critical to elections moving forward here.
Well, that's a similar tale in a lot of communities and across a lot of states, particularly the Latino community or even the African American community. People say, "Oh, they only show up at voting times," but I think we've done a good job the party has done a good job of reaching out to all communities across this particular election cycle because they understand how important it is. You think we're ready to go for November the 8th? We still, it's not over. We got to sprint through that finish line, but are we looking good in your estimation?
Like you said, I think there's still a lot of work to do. I think we're about to see a lot of these last minute pushes for advertisements in Latino newspapers and advertisements in Spanish to drive out the Latino vote. That is, the work of the local caucuses and the work of the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia to make sure we're echoing that. But if we're on the right track, and hopefully we are, because I've been doing this over the course of the last 2 years, we saw that about 60% of Latinos in Virginia voted for President Joe Biden during the presidential elections. Then we drove up that vote to 66% for Terry McAuliffe in the Latino vote. So hopefully we're doing the right thing. There's another 6% that we can gain for these elections, and we're moving forward in that way. But any sort of movement forward would be a success, and just make sure that we're driving those numbers of Latino voters.
Well, if we can show up as well as better than what we did in the election before the last election, we don't want to go back there again. We have some challenges in that election where we lost some things. But I think if we get the same numbers that came out in the presidential election year, and we break the mold of what they said about people don't come out after they win their presidential elections, whatever the party is. I don't think that's true. I really don't even like to talk about it. I mentioned it, but I think we're on track to make that happen. But as I keep telling people, if you want things to happen, you got to come out to vote. If you don't come out to vote, bad things will happen, i.e. 2016. So if you don't want those things to happen, people need to come out. So if you were going to have some special words that you would put out here yourself for, I think you mentioned how the party can help the Latino community. What are things that you would say specifically to the Latino community that you think would really encourage them, or some things that you would do to encourage that community to actually come out and support the Democratic ticket, even though they have been? Any particular areas that you would focus on more so than others?
Yeah, I think it's reinforcing that our vote matters in this country. We come from countries and generations where we have this feeling that our vote's not going to matter. The election systems are rigged back in Latin America in many instances that we've seen and that our families have seen. And so when we come to the United States and where we're eligible to vote, it's saying our vote matters. And it's tremendously important for Latinos to make their voices heard. Otherwise, other people are going to make those decisions for us. You mentioned at the start of this as well, that if you don't vote, you're basically casting a vote for the other side. And it's so important that Latinos are making sure that we're showing up to vote. At the end of the day, something tremendously unique, I think, about the Latino community is that we vote in community, we vote in familia, as we like to say. And sometimes not everybody in our household is eligible to vote. But when one member of that household or that family shows up to vote, we're really carrying the message and the weight of our entire family. And saying, we're voting for this candidate, we're voting for this progress and this change that we want to see. And it's tremendously important for, let's say it's your tia, it's your aunt who can't vote for whatever reason, is talking to you and sharing her opinions about this, because you're going to be able to take that vote and say, I'm voting on behalf of my community. I'm voting on behalf of my family for the progress that we want to see.
Any upcoming events you want to tell anyone about? I know there's a Voto, I think an event that some other folks have been working on that's going to happen in Woodbridge. I don't know whether you're aware of it. Are you guys? Well,
Yeah.
I'm telling you what I know. Tell me what you know.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we're in Hispanic Heritage Month, and it's 11 more days of fun-filled events that keep us tremendously busy. I think this weekend in particular is going to have quite a few events. But there is a Spanish or Latino door knocking event happening for Congresswoman Spanberger, for example. That's happening, I believe, this weekend. It's on the 8th, if I'm not mistaken, but we can get that information out to you. And so that's tremendously important for Latinos who are able to speak, Spanish, or are able to resonate with some of the issues of the community, are just able to be present and show up and have those conversations again with La Tia, El Vecino, whoever it might be that needs to hear the message of the Democratic Party. In addition to that, I know there are local committees as well celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. So tuning into those, I know Arlington Democrats, for example, has an event on the 9th on Sunday. There's also events happening across the Commonwealth for local candidates. I know there's a lot of focus right now on the congressional races, and there should be, but we also have Latinos running at the local level. So for example, Sonia Vasquez Luna is running for Manassas City Council, and that's a great candidate that we should be supporting there. And then we have Vivian Sanchez Jones running in Roanoke. And so these are candidates in areas that aren't always the focus. I think it's always Northern Virginia, it's always Richmond. But we have local elections that are tremendously important happening at the same time. So this will be happening now. Like you said, the work continues until November 8th, until really the day after when all the votes are counted and we're moving forward there. But there's quite a lot of activity. So the best way to just know what's happening is to, I'm going to make the plug to follow VADM Latinos on social media across all platforms, just to make sure that you're up to date with what's happening on behalf of the Democratic Party and the Latino community.
Well, that's great. I'm going to ask the question that I usually ask when I get to towards the end of our time here, even though I kind of ate up a little of your time. So we can stay as long as we want to. As long as you have time to talk, I'll talk with you. But what I did want to ask you about is what I ask all folks. If you were king for a day, sir, and you had that magic scepter, you could make anything happen just by waving that scepter and saying, make it so. What was the first thing that you would go and do?
I think being altruistic and something that I've always really focused on is just this feeling of compassion and getting rid of ignorance. It's something that, it's not a policy platform that I have right now, but just making people more compassionate to the stories of folks either immigrating or who don't look like them is something that we can do as a global community, but really here focused in Virginia and the United States at large. We're such a diverse population. And the inputs that are coming in from either immigrants or from people who don't look like us or don't think like us only makes our country better, only makes our communities better. So if I had that magic power right now to just say, hey, let's get rid of something, it's just the tremendous level of ignorance that sometimes exists in the ways that we're interacting with folks who don't always look like us. It's something that I get to carry the extra burden of being Latino, but also being a member of the LGBTQ community, to communities that don't often see eye to eye. And so it's something that I strive for, of just making sure there's more inclusion of marginalized members in our community.
Well, that's a fantastic thing. I don't know why and I keep saying this. I think I got a pretty good look for people, because I thought you were going to say something similar to that. Not quite, but you were right on the same thing. So that's fantastic. So, Jonathan, I'll just wrap up things by just saying to you now, I think that the DLOV organization is doing some great things in Virginia. Are you looking to stay there a little longer, or what sort of aspirations? I usually don't ask another question after that question. I'm just asking you, because you did mention that you were going to be an attorney. And is there any other things that we may want to keep an eye out on looking at Jonathan Dromgoole to see what's next for him?
Yeah, so I think right now we're all focused on the elections coming up, and so not gonna take any attention away from that. But I've mentioned it of how important it is to increase Latino representation across the Commonwealth. We less than 2% of all elected offices in Virginia are held by a member of the Latino community, yet we make up 11% of the Commonwealth. So there's definitely a disparity there that I'm hoping that we're going to work towards achieving And so, you never know. I'm keeping my options open.
Well, I think you should keep them open because you've done a lot of great things. We're coming to the end of the show, and I just want to let you know it was a pleasure having you on. I've got to know you a little bit better. I've seen you at a lot of different events. This is the first time I've had a chance to actually sit down and talk with you for a while. And I look forward to doing that again. And we're going to get things done coming up on November the 8th.
Yep.
But before we go, we're going to leave out with a little bit of Bob. We'll see you next time. Come on back and see us, Jonathan.
Thank you.
See you later. Thank you for being on the show.